Hello, everybody. So, this is going to focus on why there's so much talk and pressure and rumors and planning and coordination for World War III. All right, now this should come relatively easily. The US did really well post World War II. And it wasn't necessarily because the war in itself did, well, essentially, at least in the US, the constant need to produce spun up all the factories, all the mining operations. It spun up industry. The reason why the US did well is because, of course, Europe was a bombed out shithole and they needed to rebuild, and they could either get the materials from us or they can get it from the Soviets. If they got it from the Soviets, they would essentially become puppets of the USSR. Okay. So that there was an instant fear there. Also, Roosevelt decided it would be a smart idea to print up a whole bunch of money and hand it to the European governments so they can buy American goods, machines, hardware, tools to rebuild their countries. And they did. Now we have a problem. Now, given a good chunk of this is self inflicted, it's not like all of the boomers and the corporations they were in charge of didn't send all of the industrial capacity over to China and India and even Russia, but most eventually, but mostly, through sock puppet companies, through shells. Um, but most of it was China, Southeast Asia. Okay. Using Russia as the piggy bank for resources for all those operations. Essentially, the American economy and the European economy is in the exact same position. Not the exact same, but relatively close. There is a shortage of quality collateral. There is in addition to the shortage of quality collateral, you also have the breaking of collateral production chains. Okay. So the housing market, of course, people go out, they buy houses. What happens when you buy a house? Well, the house itself is collateral, but so is the debt. All right. And because house prices consistently go up, you can essentially create a never ending borrowing and lending daisy chain of collateral and debt. This creates essentially an infinite money machine. All right. And there's tons of them in the US economy. But it's largely relegated to areas that key players have access to that normal people don't. Normal people can borrow against their houses, but they can't take advantage of an infinite collateral chain that allows them to borrow infinitely until the end of time. Okay? With a declining population, declining birth rates because the resources aren't there, and instead of spreading the wealth and doing any kind of reasonable redistribution and trying to avoid having to do any kind of significant taxation, um, obviously the corporations are largely in charge of the United States government and they're multinational, so in the end, they don't really care. But the US is in a really weak position. In Europe's case, to prop up their socialism, they need an incredible amount of raw resources with that collateral. There's only one place for Europe to get those vast amounts of cheap raw resources: Russia. All right. In the case of the United States, being the world's reserve currency and having outsourced all its goddamn manufacturing overseas, The US situation is pretty simple. It needs infinite slave labor, and it needs whatever country it deals with to never try to attain um, an equal footing. The reason there's so much pressure against China isn't just Trump, it's been a thing that's been building for a long time. China has been slowly and methodically building itself up so it can stand on the same footing as the US. So it could legitimately become a challenger to the US. Now, is China necessarily interested in directly challenging the US and attaining global supremacy? Probably not. Probably not. Because anybody who looks at the situation for what it is knows the United States killed its fucking economy. And in the process, like if you look at the numbers, China's essentially a 20 billion or $20 trillion economy, with the United States being a 30 some $1 trillion economy. When you actually look at images, charts, layouts, the American economy would have been a 50, 60, 70, $80 trillion economy. And then every other country on earth would have been nothing in comparison. All right. But we did the outsourcing, we did the offshoring, we exported all the factories first to Mexico and then to China. All the cheap labor, it was great. Now the Chinese know how to produce everything, literally everything, and they've produced literally everything. They have all the schematics, all the plans. They literally have the know how and the industrial capacity to do whatever the hell they want. And they are investing. All right. They are playing the same game that we do when it comes to going to foreign countries, cutting deals to build infrastructure, effectively taking over the countries via those debts. And, just basic strong arm intimidation. Um, they are, how was it? There was a book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I do recommend that. Um, China's essentially doing the same thing. The only problem is that China was actually smart enough to go out and target important resources, really important resources. And whilst we've been going off the rails with the massive push for, yeah, just let all the migrants in, uh, no one is illegal, um, just the idea, brain drain the rest of the world, take all of the people except for every one Indian engineer you get 10 welfare bums. Okay. That's just the reality. America is not the widespread land of success for the majority of people. It is for a very select few, but not a lot. Not a lot. Um, Regardless, the situation that the US is in, the only way that the US and maybe Europe can escape the death spiral that's coming, just economically, financially, the only way that it can avoid what's coming is by wiping Russia off the map, wiping China off the map. And this is in industrial capacity, this is in population, this is in a lot of areas. Now, the Eastern Bloc has a pretty good idea of what's coming if they don't make their moves, which is why they've been making their moves. And they're both in this nonstop tit for tat. All right, and each movement, it's a ratchet. It slowly ratchets up the tension and gets us closer to the end point where everything just explodes. Okay. Now, it's not a pretty realization, but the reality is that the only way to restabilize the U.S. economy is if we can get the entirety of the U.S. back into manufacturing, actually have decent jobs for the American population. Um, Bringing in migrants isn't necessarily working out too well, because the whole idea of the melting pot, it works really well. The melting pot works really well when you take a bunch of ethnic Europeans, who were separated by line after line after line on a map, but genetically are pretty interlinked. All right, whether it be from Roman invasions into France, uh, or the Huns invasion into Europe, the Slavs, the Ostrogoths, or the Goths and the Ostrogoths, back and forth, constant territorial wars, constant breeding. The European genetics are a mixed bag anyway. But people took those lines very seriously. Anyway, Western civilization and Eastern civilization. I when I say Eastern civilization, Chinese, East Asian civilization, is relatively decently compatible with Western civilization. At the very least, it could peaceably coexist. All right, could peaceably coexist. The problem is, um, how do I put this nicely? Um, the more Islamic parts of Eastern civilization, after God knows how many years, over a decade, 2 decades, bombing the shit out of those desert countries and African countries and supporting the black market arms trade and wars and genocides and problems. Um, yeah, importing all those people who we bombed religiously for decades and expecting them to integrate into Western society. Not the smartest move. But anyway, we did that. And I don't know if you've noticed, but the overall situation when it comes to Western culture is increasing enforcement, trying to silence, pointing out the problems that are occurring. Um, Sweden is a good example. I believe, last I knew, the United Kingdom has beaten Sweden in a certain metric that shall not be mentioned. Um, and if the US stayed on the same track, we would certainly smoke the UK in that metric. Um, Luxury ideology, not exactly the best idea. Also, the idea that we would just bring all these people in and you know use them for cheap labor domestically, not the best idea. As it turns out, it you generally have a better, more well apportioned, stable society when you actually employ your own fucking children. Apologies. Anyway, the U.S. economy is in such a bad spot that essentially it has to wipe out all of its competition in order to survive. Now, it might be able to leave a certain amount of Europe untouched, but essentially, if the U.S. wants to have any kind of a future, and this is not taking artificial intelligence into account, this is pre AI world. Um, if the US wants to survive and still have 5% of the global population using like 50% or more of the global resource flows, we have to wipe out all the competition to do it, which means we have to wipe out China, we have to wipe out Russia, we have to wipe out most of Europe, we have to essentially send the developed parts of Africa back into the Stone Age. Um, South America, for the most part, would be left alone because Monroe Doctrine, and they're right there. Um, Generally, you don't shit on your own doorstep. All right. Um, Tends to lead to odd problems. Uh, yeah. So that's essentially the position that the U.S. is in. It needs to destroy all the foreign competitive industrial capacity, even if it used to be ours, um, in order to justify bringing back any of that production, bringing back jobs, stabilizing the economic situation, and trying to get this country back on a decent financial footing. And part of that, we could keep the global reserve currency status. We could, if we could achieve that. Um, but just about all of these countries have nuclear weapons. And whilst we could wipe out a large amount of the global industrial capacity, uh, it would not be a fun exchange. Because if you back Russia into the corner, they're going to push the button. If you back China into a corner, they're going to push the button. North Korea into a corner, they're going to push a button. Maybe a wood button, may not be connected to anything, but they're going to push a button. It's not a stable situation. All right. Also, they need the distraction because it's getting very hard for them to pretend that the economy is doing great. The last speech that Trump came out with, uh, the economy is not strong. Prices are not really coming down. Gas prices dipped for a little bit. War in Venezuela, whether it's U.S. against Venezuela or because China and Russia say they're going to back Venezuela, a proxy war in South America. I'm sure that's totally not going to send the oil prices skyrocketing. There's no winning. It is a global catch 22. We need room for existing economies to grow, and we need to eliminate the competition to do it at a strictly base, more Malthusian way of looking at things. In terms of considering AI, we don't have the power capacity to actually build out AI the way that they want to. We don't. I mean, we do have skilled people to run the machines, do all the things, but we just don't have the pay rates to get people up and off their ass. All right, trust me, I know tons of these people. They're skilled, they're trained, they're waiting for jobs that pay worth a damn. Okay, it's a thing. Um, you can't really motivate people who went to college, jumped through many hoops, with jobs that pay them less than they can make working at a factory right now. Honestly, some factories, not even joking, some factories might legitimately be paying people better than doctors right now. When you adjust for the student loan, the crushing student loans and the never ending interest they're going to have to pay on $1 million worth of student loan debt, 500,000 to 1 million. Yeah, yeah. People, people in the West are not motivated. And the other thing is too with the idea of a war, of a more conventional war at the very least. It also gives the justification to print unreasonably large sums of money that you can use to rebuild the infrastructure that's crumbling, uh, essentially rebuild the entire economic structure. Now, as for the other side of this, anybody who was paying attention to Klaus um, in some of his speeches and what he's talked about, one of the plans of a certain organization was to do everything humanly possible to bring Western economies to their knees. It's important you remember that part, that there was indeed a plan to create so much chaos that people would beg for whatever solution would be presented to them. And that solution would be things like digital IDs, things like universal basic income, things like universal health care, things that on their face you can make reasonable arguments for. The problem is who controls it. Because if you look at something like the European Union, you don't vote for those people. They're just installed. Not really too democratic. I mean, they'll cry about democracy and all that shit, but in terms of democratic institutions, they are dirtier than fucking sin. All right? And the US, for the most part, we're not too democratic either. We get two choices every 4 years. Giant douche, turd sandwich, to reference South Park. And the consequences, as you've seen, they're all, two wings, same bird. Same damn thing that you would naturally expect. Oh, more wars. More drone strikes. More problems. Things that actually affect normal people within the society don't get addressed, don't get fixed, don't get dealt with. Things that help the global agenda in one way or another, those things get dealt with. Those things get all of the money, time, attention, effort, energy. Meanwhile, people, whether they're in the Rust Belt or the Silicon Dungeon, all right, they got nothing to look forward to other than worsening economic situations, declining health, and a declining standard of living. It's a thing. Instead of just having a reasonable spread in society, uh, if if normal people are going to have anything, at least in economic terms, in terms of opportunity, uh, it will not come at the cost of the billionaire class, of the ownership classes of America. They very much would like to, at least from what it seems, they'd very much like to start a massive world war, consolidate or write off large portions of the debts, capture as many resources as humanly possible, collateralize them, get them into the financial systems to fill the black holes, hopefully once and for all, and prop the game up as long as they can. Might buy them another 50 to 100 years. The maps, the countries would get significantly bigger, or it'd just be a lot more broken up puppet regimes that answer to quote unquote the big boss. Okay. The people in charge very much don't want to share. All right, that's the reality of it. As conspiratorial as it might sound, open your eyes, pay attention. You'd see how things are going. You see how the world is moving. All right. I think that pretty much sums up the important points. The fact that we have persistent inflation is a pretty good sign that things are not going well. The fact that after all of the years of people preaching to buy gold and silver and a horde of people who were religiously against it, the fact that now literally every platform and all of the banks and advisors from them are coming out and saying, you know what, it's time to look at the balance of a portfolio again. And it's just like, oh, yeah, so the people pushing silver and gold were right, huh? Couldn't keep the prices suppressed forever in a hyperinflation environment. I mean, in a slightly increased inflation environment. Yeah, where purchasing power declines, local and state and federal government gets to screw people out of the pensions that they promised and Social Security. So all they have to do is pass one bill and freeze cost of living adjustments for 5, 10 years, and meanwhile they'll just print and print and print and print. It's a really weak position to be in, and honestly, coming back to it again, there is no using the actual legal structuring of the system itself. There is no solution for the problems of the American pseudo capitalist economy. These problems that we have now can't be solved by capitalism, and they can't even be solved by, capitalism light. They can't be solved by socialism, even. The kind of problems that the US has, that Europe has, that Canada has, that most of the Western allied countries in World War II have, most of these problems can only be solved by communism, and they don't have the economic, ethnic, or cultural integrity to pull that off anymore. So it's going to be really interesting times. Really, really interesting times. Regardless, of course, I can't give financial advice, and I am not giving financial advice. But what I would say is, if you were at all concerned about the stability of governments and their ability to uh, maintain and come through with the promises that they've made over the past 100+ years, you may want to consider possibly having a meeting to discuss the possible future topic of maybe uh, acquiring metallic assets if you're trying to save purchasing power. Otherwise, if you're the average person, you might be better off just trying to get to know people and set up networks with people. So you can hopefully get the stuff you need, and other people can get the stuff they need. And, you know, if the paper economy collapses on its own, by hook or by crook, at the very least, there'll be a certain amount of supply flows and impromptu personal production. Just a thought, just an idea, something for you to consider. I'm going to end it there. Once again, this is Michael from Spades Consulting. Check back here for videos. I'm trying to get one video out every day around 2 o'clock Eastern Time. Check out the Substack, where occasionally write some much less, much more thought out, less pause heavy content. It's free. It's not behind a paywall. You can optionally Sign up for a subscription to the Substack, and in return, you get a higher value discount on services from us every month. If you are interested in personal or business consultations, head to spadesconsulting.com and we'll get you set up. And with that, I'm out. You guys have a good one.